It's our pleasure now to have as the Cunningham lecturer the Hon Dr Kay Patterson AO with the provocative title, "Will You Still Need Me? Will You Still?" And we'll find out what the rest is. Kay was appointed the Age Discrimination Commissioner relatively recently, July 2016, as she said, in succession to Susan Ryan. That caps, at this point, a career that I guess began at leaving school at age 15. I guess you say it's a career when you leave school and seek to do things, in this case managing a small business, and then returning to school and ultimately gaining a BA Honours at the University of Sydney and a PhD in psychology and a Dip Ed at Monash University. Kay taught allied health, as she was indicating in the launch of the book, and for about 11 years. She studied gerontology at the University of Michigan and at Pennsylvania State University. That trajectory was altered strongly with election to the Senate in 1987, and after serving on a number of Senate committees and holding various shadow portfolios, in 1988 she was appointed Parliamentary Secretary, and in 2001 appointed to Cabinet and served in the Health and Social Security portfolios. And she retired from Cabinet in 2006 and from the Senate in 2008, and now, as we've indicated, is sallying forth as the Age Discrimination Commissioner, and has been doing so for over a few months now, and we're looking forward to, therefore, a picture of where this is going and what the preoccupations will be, and in our minds, of course, how social science will be serving a good cause. Okay, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Glenn, and I have to be a bit more serious than I was launching the book. I am delighted to be here and to present the 2016 Cunningham lecture. I looked at the ASA website, and it said it was to be given by a distinguished social science person. I thought I don't quite fit that, but anyway, I'll try. Kenneth Cunningham's contribution as a teacher and as a serviceman and as an educational psychologist was outstanding, and it is fitting that a lecture is given annually in his name, and it's quite daunting I was asked to do it, but it's a great honour as well. Preparing for this has taken me down the highways and byways of my educational and professional life, and on searching for information about Kenneth Cunningham, one of the references was Professor William Connell's History of the ACER, 1930 to 1980. Is there anybody here who remembers Bill Connell? A few of us. And it took me down another path as I thought about Professor Donald Sperrit and Professor Ray Debus and Bill Connell. And some of you in the audience have just indicated you'll remember some or all of them, and like me were taught by these giants of Australian education. In fact, my course in education at Sydney University was really what I thought university was going to be about. I was going to be stretched and challenged. Some of the courses I didn't come up to my expectations. But one of them that Bill Connell ran was in his own home, where we'd go as a honours class of about 8 or 9 of us, and we were given a book to prepare for. We had to read it before we came, and if you didn't read it, it was quite obvious because you might be in the hot seat and have to answer questions about the book. And we had books like C.P. Snow's Two Cultures and The Second Look, or Robert Young's Brighter Than a Thousand Suns, or Fulbright's Arrogance of Power. And Bill's premise was you should be able to leave the university being able to discuss and debate issues of moment outside your own area of specialty. And he used to say to us, "I'm going to make you argue to the roots of your intellect." And he did. And sometimes I came out from those classes, which sometimes didn't finish till 10:30 or 11, feeling almost nauseated because I thought, I can't think anymore. It was a great, great challenge, and what a great contribution he made to social sciences and to lots and lots of our students. But that was a little lane I was taken down. As you know, from 1970, I taught at Lincoln Institute for about 11 years, and I ended my teaching days at Lincoln before Lincoln went to La Trobe. I say went. They thought we were taken over by, we thought we'd merged. There was a bit of a difference of opinion. Some of you will remember the days when interlibrary loans took about 3 weeks to come. I came into this place and I said to the library, I would like to get a particular book. And they said, when do you need it, Senator? I do feel a bit odd in the green carpet. I've never spoken in the green carpet before. When do you need it, Senator? I said, well, I'm going back Friday. This is Monday. Oh, we have 3 deliveries from the National Library every day. I'm thinking, oh, I could have done my PhD in 2 weeks here. You know, you call for a journal and it'd come 3 months later, and if you got an article you wondered when it came why on earth you'd ordered it, what relevance it had to what you were doing, or the horror of when you photostated an article, I think it was sixpence, and you filed it in a manila folder, and then you opened it and all was left was sort of black grit on yellow paper. Some of you won't know what I'm talking about, the young ones here. It was a disaster. So you had to read the article before it disintegrated. Now, we've come a long way since then with e-journals available immediately at the click of a mouse, and instant sharing of knowledge and research and collaboration, not just between researchers within the country, but across the globe, and that's common practice. As I mentioned, I was teaching health science students and I was becoming more and more interested in the study of gerontology. I was acutely aware of the increasing, and I was unsettled by the fact that there was an increasing number of people, the baby boomers were reaching the peak of their adult lives, and that policies were not in place to deal with the impending increase in the number of older people that would occur in the ensuing 40 or so years. And this led me to pursue, as you heard earlier, an interest in gerontology and to co-develop the first diploma of gerontology. And I introduced life cycle developmental courses and gerontology into the undergraduate programs. Now that was a battle, I have to tell you, because I was trying to talk to the clinicians, the OTs, the speech therapists and other departments that we needed to put gerontology into the course. And they said, why gerontology? We already have geriatrics. And I said, well, really, we do child psychology and they do paediatrics. Don't they need to know about the well older person as well as knowing about the well older child? And we gradually won the battle and we put it in. Now, some of you may want to know how I got from there into this place. Well, my friend Lorraine Elliott, who was John Elliott's first wife, was the Vice President of the Liberal Party. And I said to her, what in the hell are you doing? We've got no retirement income policy, aged care is a terrible mess, da-di-da-di-da. She said, join up or shut up. So I avoided her for about 3 months. And she said, look, you've developed an interest in this area. It's a policy area you should actually put into practice. You'll get steel in your heart sitting on the fence. I said, I want to be elected head of department. No. And there are 27 Labor voters, 1 cupboard Liberal and me. And she said, doesn't matter. Stand up for what you believe. Get in there and do something. And the whole group of women who were who started the Liberal Party with Menzies realised that these were women who would have been professors but didn't get the opportunity. They were bright, intelligent women, as there were in the Labor Party, running behind the scenes, and all the voluntary organisations in Australia. And they said to me, you need to get in there and do something in the Senate's where you should be, because it's about education, it's about health, and it's about ageing. It's the sort of things you're interested in. Well, the battles that I had in Lincoln to promote issues affecting older people continued when I got up here. I was really concerned that people, especially women, were being forced to retire at 65 when many had not saved enough for retirement or could clearly benefit from extending their working years. In 1990, the then Minister for Social Security at the time had given an undertaking to remove age discrimination from all existing federal legislation. Oh, whoopee, I was really thrilled. Nothing happened. I was frustrated with the inaction and prompted by the numerous representations I had from public servants and statutory office holders who were being forced to retire at 65. I introduced a private members' bill into the Senate in 1992 to abolish compulsory retirement in the Australian public service. Well, I can tell you private members' bills don't have a great history of success. I think at that stage there had been about 9, and I was hoping, in the history of Australian Parliament, I was hoping to get my little bill up. Well, it didn't see the light of day. In 1992, the government responded to the House of Representatives Standing Committee for Long-Term Strategies report, and the government gave in principle support to ending compulsory age retirement. Again, I was a bit excited, and it wasn't acted on. In 1993, you can see how long this battle went on for, Senator Bolkus indicated that the government intended to act, but the Attorney General's Department was working towards a comprehensive age discrimination policy. So we waited. 1994, the McLeod report reviewing the Public Service Act concluded that, I didn't actually see many social scientists when I turned around either, I have to say. In 1994, the McLeod report reviewing the Public Service Act concluded that compulsory retirement should be excluded from the revised Act. Should be excluded from the revised Act. So I thought, oh damn, that's gone to hell in the basket. We're not going to get it now. We had an election in 1993, you'll remember that one that couldn't be lost. And my 1992 bill lapsed, as all bills do when you have the proroguing of Parliament. And I resubmitted the bill in 1995. You know, hope against hope. It wasn't brought forward because the government of the day has the right to determine whether a private member's bill comes forward. It didn't come forward. But another opportunity came my way. I was given the task of developing the government's preparations for the International Year of Older Persons. Never one to look a good gift horse in the mouth, I lobbied hard for us to remove the compulsory retirement age for Commonwealth public servants and statutory office holders. Statutory office holders, when I became first aware of it was I went to the War Memorial and they were telling me that if you were a Lieutenant Colonel and you'd been appointed to the board of the War Memorial, you have to leave at 65, which I thought was absolutely stupid, all these people with enormous experience. So in 1999, we got the Commonwealth Public Servants Act, and in 2001, we got the statutory office holders. So it took me a while, but I managed to do it, and putting it through our policy process. The Age Discrimination Act took a little bit longer, and it was enacted in 2004. In my advocacy, lecture and political battles involving the affairs of older people, I've had in mind the concerns of those older people, and I was concerned and knew that one day they'd be mine, and that of the enormous cohort of baby boomers born after the World War II. And you know, self-interest is always a very good motivator, and declare a conflict of interest in all this stuff I was doing, because I wouldn't be the Age Discrimination Commission if we hadn't had the removal of the compulsory age for statutory office holders. Baby boomers over age 65 and over make up approximately 15% of the Australian population. Some of this stuff will be very familiar for you. And the 2015 Intergenerational Report has projected that number of boomers to enter this age range will be more than double in 2055. Little did I know when I was preparing for this lecture, I must just remember that I don't have a PSM, Mary. I didn't give them that on the back of it. It said Kay Patterson AO PSM, Public Service Medal it is. I don't have a Public Service Medal, I just remembered as I was standing here. Little did I know why did that link up? Because I saw the title of the speech. And when I provided the abstract and title for this lecture, Adam Graycar, who unfortunately can't be here tonight, had used the same title for a speech in June 1988. And he sent me a copy, produced on a typewriter in Pica font. In the abstract, this was only 1988, the year after I came here. In the abstract of this lecture, I refer to Paul McCartney's famous song, Will You Still Need Me, which he penned in 1966 at the age of 24, when the oldest of Australia's baby boomers were just turning 20. Despite Paul contemplating turning 64, for most boomers, it was probably the furthest thing from their mind, and for most of them would have seemed totally impossible. Indeed, they'd been immersed in the youth culture in the 60s and exposed to popular cultural references at the time. One of my staff said she'd never heard of these songs. It made me feel very old, expressing the exact opposite, this music, with famous lines like, forever young, and I hope I die before I get old, saturating our radios, and some of you remember those songs. But the demographic clock stops for no one. And for many years it had been ticking away in the background until we finally saw some major reforms beginning to emerge in the 1980s. It had taken far too long. Social surveys and studies about the older pre-war generations had been conducted since the 1950s and even earlier in Britain and the USA. How can we learn from the past to meet the demographic challenges and opportunities now and in the future? As social scientists, researchers, economists and demographers, what can we do better to achieve much needed outcomes and timely change for the ageing cohort of baby boomers? Now, earlier today at your symposium, you discussed the impact of social science on public policy. And we know that social science is a powerful discipline that is able to fill the gaps in our knowledge about ageing. It's able to inform and guide public policy, as well as drive change that is both far-sighted and appreciative of the past. In this lecture, I want to spend some time looking at what scientists were saying about ageing generations from the 50s, and how does this compare with how the cohort of ageing boomers are doing now? How can we do better at ensuring evidence-based outcomes? Now, Pat Jalland, in her book Old Age in Australia, a history published just last year, refers to the various social science surveys and studies that have been conducted from the 1950s in Australia on our older pre-war generations. The Hutchison Report was the first major social survey of older people in Victoria, and described by Jalland the first detailed report on the subject in Australia. Among other findings, the report identified issues regarding the inadequacy of the age pension and recommended the abolishment of its harsh means test. It drew the link between old age retirement and poverty, and noted the particular vulnerability of older women who are more likely to be in poverty and living alone in their old age. All sounds very familiar, doesn't it? It considered Australia's early retirement system wasteful, costly and demoralising, recommending that those fit and willing to work should be encouraged to do so. It's ironic that it's still the message of Susan Ryan's Willing to Work report launched in May of this year. How many years on? The poor living conditions of some older Victorians was also recognised and paired with the recommendation for building smaller homes for the elderly, as opposed to continued expansion of large institutional nursing homes. The Henderson Report, 40 years ago, noted an increase in the poverty of older people in Melbourne, with those over 65 and single women over 60 being the largest single identifiable group of people in poverty in Australia. More appropriate accommodation and subsidised housing for the elderly was recommended, along with greater assistance for carers at home and increased home care services. It could be a report today. The Macleay Report of 1982, over 30 years ago, reiterated this need for increased home care, reflecting earlier findings about older people's value of independence and preference to age at home and remain in the community, which ran counter to the government's continued investment in nursing homes at the time. It is disturbing to note the ongoing nature of many of these issues for today's older population. Concerns of the ageing baby boomers today, such as appropriate and affordable housing, the barriers of age discrimination, especially in employment, the vulnerability of older women and the desire of most older people to remain in the community and receive support at home, are echoed in the narratives of these early social science reports. However, as we discuss later, the situation of the baby boomers now is also vastly different from that of pre-war generations due to their particular lived experiences and changing conditions. Who is, or are we all, responsible for the repetitive nature of the recommendations and the length of time that passes before we see any major social policy action? With respect to aged care, it would not be until the mid-late 1980s that major social reforms would restructure the aged care system to increase home care services for older people, and even then changes were slow, inadequate and out of sync with the rapidly ageing cohort of baby boomers and increasing demand. Jalland quotes Kendig and McCallum's bleak observations in Greying Australia in 1986. And I quote, "There is no advocate with a political clout," he hadn't realised I was in Parliament by then, I don't think. "There is no advocate with a political clout to compete with the nursing home industry. Unless the political will can be mobilised to improve services, there will be more misuse of expensive institutional care in dealing with non-critical patients, inadequate care of older people at home, and continuing heavy burdens on daughters and other carers." In between the Hutchison Report and the Macleay Report, between 54 and 82, There were numerous other social surveys and reports conducted in New South Wales, Victoria and other states, often reiterating and reinforcing earlier findings and recommendations that would not be implemented or implemented decades later. Julland and others have pointed to particular social and political forces of the time that have acted to impede the translation of social research to policy. I quote from Julland's book: "The outcome of many admirable reports on aged care up to 1980 was woeful. As Anna Howe observed in 1990, from the mid-1970s to the early 1980s, some 8,000 new private nursing home beds were established. The total outlays on nursing home care in all sectors increased more than fivefold between 1972 and 1982. She argues that the many policy failures and abortive inquiries were partly due to the inability of bureaucratic solutions to solve complex structural problems. As Dr Sydney Sachs saw it, the earlier inquiries were conducted by officials who were lacking in political clout." Now, I have some view about the delay in implementation and translation, which I'll return to later. The economic downturn of the 70s and high unemployment also diffused the 50s campaign for increasing the male retirement age, pushing the matter further down the agenda for the government at the time. In relation to the Hutchison report, Julland observes that though the report was published as a book, little effort seems to be made to promote and distribute it, perhaps due to the adverse press response. Social sciences recognise the value of examining history to inform the present. The reflections that have been made about the political, social, economic and media forces standing in the way of major social change in the 20th century certainly carry a timely reminder for us to beware of these influences as we develop policy for the 21st century. But in addition to these extraneous forces, there are lessons to be learned in terms of the acts and omission of those of us in the social science disciplines. How can we ensure that our research provides an evidence base for policy and is acted on? Are we outcome driven? Do we take our research and sell it to government and relevant stakeholders? Do we make an effort to insert ourselves into other courses and disciplines that affect older people, such as urban development and financial planning? Do we make appropriate connections outside social science circles to fuel debate in our research, to gather interest and excite the curiosity of others? Despite the ongoing nature of some issues, it is important to recognise that the generation of older baby boomers are a distinct cohort, shaped by their particular life experiences, values, opportunities and social, economic and cultural conditions. And these differences must be factored into policy responses to issues of ageing in our present time. I always feel a little bit left out of all of this because I wasn't a baby boomer and nobody talks about the war babies in the literature much. Now, I remember that we didn't have elastic. I think there are a few people here who are old enough to remember the days with post-war without elastic. And we used to have a little pearl, not boys, but the girls had a little pearl button with a little loop. And when you didn't have much hips when you were 2 or 3, and there was no elastic around the bottom of your bloomers, they hung down. And I've suffered terribly all my life because my father used to call me Aggie Dribble Drawers. And nobody ever talks about the damage that's been done to war babies of lack of things as simple as elastic. But anyway, I'm not too concerned because there are a lot more baby boomers there were of us, but I just wanted to point that out, that it would be nice if somebody mentioned this occasionally. SALT does include those of us born before the war, but not many others do. We know, so the differences in these groups need to be factored into policy responses to issues of ageing in our present time. We know, for example, that with rising life expectancies, Australian baby boomers can now expect to live well into their 80s and beyond. That's on average an extra 25 years more than their parents' and grandparents' generation, and these additional years of life will have an enormous impact both on the baby boomers' well-being and younger generations. And much has been said about the fiscal impacts of this ageing cohort and the pressures it will place on our economy, public health, welfare systems and younger generations. But Susan Ryan argued in her 2014 keynote address to the ASSA Symposium, we must stop wallowing in the language of ageing tsunamis, crises and catastrophes, but instead face the demographic challenges and opportunities head on. We know that unlike the previous generation, Australians aged 45 years and over are intending to work longer than ever before. The latest data from the ABS Retirement Intentions 2014 survey shows that 71% of persons intended to retire at the age of 65 years. This was up from 48% 10 years before. More people are also intending to retire at older ages of 70 or over. Count me into that group. I mightn't have got into the baby boom group, but I'm in that group. Compared to the previous generation, older boomers are also likely to live many more years free of disability. Therefore, instead of complaining about unsuitable burdens, we must be thinking about how we can assist older workers and older people who are in good health and willing to work to do just that. And if they're not doing voluntary work, to reskill if necessary. And it's crucial that governments and employers reimagine retirement, workplaces and work practices, such as flexible work options, mobile places of work and opportunities for reverse mentoring. The banks now allow people over 55 to go into a flexible working arrangement, all of them, all of the big four. We also know that the baby boomers are a diverse generation with a greater experience of cultural diversity than their predecessors as a result of the high levels of post-war immigration. Almost 40% of all migrants from non-English speaking countries are 50 years and over. This is much higher than the older generations, where only 18.5% of the 80-plus population were born in non-English speaking countries. This has implications on the kinds of services older people will require, including culturally appropriate aged care services and health supports, language services, and policies appreciative of traditional networks, culture, and concepts of family and community. The baby boomers also have much higher levels of education than earlier generations, and the late Professor Graham Hugo's analysis of the ABS National Health Survey data and census data covering roughly 25-year period showed that 43% of boomers had completed secondary school compared with just 6% of the previous generation. Baby boomers are also continuing to engage in lifelong learning and education, often at a tertiary level, and we need to be thinking how we can support older people to engage in ongoing learning, apprenticeships, personal and professional development, as well as identifying early opportunities for reskilling linked to employment. The baby boom was also characterised by rising rates of female participation in both tertiary education and employment, leading to the advent of the two-income household. Although this has not translated to better employment outcomes and earnings for women from both the baby boomer and younger generations, in 2010, 79% of tertiary educated women were employed compared to 90% of similarly educated men. In 2009, women aged between 25 and 64 earned 72% of earnings of men from the same age group. Following the introduction of no-fault divorce in 1975, the baby boom saw rising rates of marital divorce and separation. In 2006, 19% of baby boomers were separated or divorced, nearly double that of previous generations. So older baby boomers will be less able to call on relatives and friends to care for them compared with the previous generation. In 1970, there were 5 people of working age supporting each Australian over 65. At current levels and current trends, this will fall to just 2.7 by 2050. The baby boom generation has high levels of home ownership and growing wealth. The majority of Australians over 65 and over own a home outright. However, home ownership is on the decline, and the number of older boomers renting is increasing, as it will with successive generations. The proportion of homeowners over 65 has fallen from 78% in 2002 to 71% just 9 years later. That's quite a significant drop from 78% to 71% in just 9 years. A recent research paper by the Swinburne Institute for Social Research has shown that if you don't own a home by midlife, that's 45 to 49, there was a strong likelihood you would never own a home. It's also said that they are close to 426,000 Australians over the age of 50 renting either alone or with a partner. This figure is forecast to hit more than 800,000 by 2050. The mean wealth of people aged 65 and above has surged more than 60% since 2001. However, wealth among baby boomers is not evenly distributed, and home ownership is a major determinant of social economic well-being. Baby boomers who are renting are vulnerable to disadvantage. We must also take intergenerational differences into account and consider the relationship between generations in our policy approaches and actions. We know that despite the rising levels of education among the boomer cohort, It is the younger generations that are most highly educated. However, young people also face their own challenges. Baby boomers who went to university from 1974 to the late 70s would have benefited from the Whitlam government's policy of free tertiary education. With the introduction of HECS in 1989, students at university now experience one of the highest tertiary education tuition fees among OECD countries, fifth highest fees after Canada, Japan, Korea and the US. In Australia, 4 out of 5 bachelor's, master's and doctoral students take out a student loan, often also benefiting from public subsidy. The number of student loans has increased by 57% in the last decade. An increasing proportion of young Australians were living with their parents until their mid-20s. In 2011, around 29% of single young adults lived with one or both of their parents. Some of you all know this. That was up 21%, up from 21% in 1976. Many of these late leavers are also boomerang kids, returning to the family home when circumstances change, such as needing to save for their first home or coming back from overseas. After leaving the home, it's estimated that 46%, sorry if you've got some who've just left, an estimated 46% will return at least once before the age of 35. Get ready. As well as these pressures on baby boom parents, there's an increased pressure to transfer wealth to the next generation. And sadly, we're seeing this leading to increased elder abuse, in particular financial abuse. It's very salutary to go and sit with the senior client advisor in one of the major banks and have them tell you story after story after story after story of people being brought into the bank by their, usually son, to take money out of the bank, and the banks can do nothing about it. I felt quite miserable after I'd been sitting with this bank person, and I said, stop, I've heard enough stories, just terrible stories of financial abuse. We need to recognise the ongoing nature of some ageing issues, but also the different circumstances and experiences of the baby boom generation and the unique policy implications they highlight. However, the same challenges still apply. How can we be more effective in advancing public policy for the ageing baby boom generation? Are we proactive in making connections? Are we making known this knowledge we have about older Australians then and now and the implications they have for policy? How do we influence politicians, statutory office holders, community leaders, stakeholders and other movers and shakers? How do we drive translation and implementation of social science research? Now, as I mentioned earlier, Anna Howe argued that the many policy failures and abortive inquiries were partly due to the inability of bureaucratic solutions to solve complex problems. And Sydney Sachs claimed earlier inquiries were conducted by officials who were lacking in political clout. Now, I know there are some current and former bureaucrats here tonight, Andrew being one of them, Andrew Podger, and I would like to acknowledge Mary Manane, who's here. I'm sure if she had the chance to get up here, she'd make a comment or two on these observations. She played a significant role in the implementation of a large number of aged care reforms and aged policies affecting older people. I think that the blame may more likely be laid at the feet of tardy and difficult ministers than should be laid at the feet of bureaucrats. We shouldn't lay all the blame at the feet of the bureaucrats, and I was a little concerned when I know Anna very well, a little concerned when I saw that some of it was laid at the feet of bureaucrats. The blame can be more fairly, I think, placed on sometimes ministers who don't push hard enough and don't assist the bureaucrats. In his 2013 Cunningham lecture, Simon Chapman expressed his concern about the difficulty of translating research findings into policy, and he presented a case study outlining the advocacy role that was needed for the introduction in Australia of plain packaging of tobacco products. He made the observation, and I quote, "It's long been banal to note that policy adoption is not simply a matter of presenting the best facts and evidence to policymakers and then sitting back to watch quality evidence triumph over all other considerations. With rare exceptions, policy entrepreneurs and advocates need to engage in extended and strategic efforts to ensure that evidence is communicated in ways that make it publicly and politically compelling, so that inaction is not an option." In 2009, he worked on a project looking at characteristics of influential Australian health researchers, and senior policymakers, politicians, their staff, and senior bureaucrats. He went on to say 3/4 of the Australian politicians we interviewed placed greater importance, I wasn't there so he didn't interview me, placed greater importance on media profile, with media presence sometimes disturbingly being seen as commensurate with expertise. For one political advisor, it was the only means of identifying experts, and the advisor said, "I've absolutely no idea how I'd go about identifying someone if there wasn't an obvious expert prominent in the media." Chapman said, in summary, the opportunity that media engagement provided for researchers to contribute to research-informed public awareness and debate was regarded not only as appropriate by most of our influential interviewees, but as a critical aspect of their professional duty to advance public health. Now, I think I can hear you saying under your breath that public, and therefore the media, are more interested in the results of medical and biomedical research than they are in the findings of the social science community. This may be so, but it should not stop social scientists from broadcasting their research, which has the potential to lead to better social, economic and individual outcomes. Nor should it stop them from developing contacts in the media and getting the good news out. Chapman says, he says to his students, when talking about the media, that if you manage to get on a breakfast show or a nightly news, it will cover a large number of people, and that among that audience will be a small number of highly influential people with power to legislate and allocate resources to your issue. It was only in March this year that the MASH actor and science advocate Alan Alda delivered an address to the National Press Club, where he spoke about the Alan Alda Centre for Communicating Science in New York. He explains that the centre provides training and accredited courses on communication for science graduates, so that when they go out into the world as capable scientists, they'll also be capable communicators. And I believe ANU has recently partnered with the Alda Centre. This could be something for us to consider in Australia, not only for medical and biomedical sciences, but also for social science, as a way of enabling more effective communication with the public, media, policymakers and others outside the discipline. What we need is an AAA, an Australian Alan Alda Social Sciences Communication Centre. Returning to Simon Chapman Cunningham address, he also said that he'd never met Nicola Roxon before she became Health Minister, and herein lies a story. I have, on many occasions at gathering of medical scientists, bemoaned the fact that I had never, or maybe once or twice, when I was a backbencher, been invited to visit a medical research institute or have requests for meetings with medical researchers. When I became Health Minister, they all came out of the woodwork. I had so little time. My secretary said to me one day, "I'm resigning." She'd been with me 20 years or 18 years, and I said, "Why?" She said, "Short of you seeing someone when you're in the bathroom, I cannot fit any more appointments in." When I asked one of the directors of the institute why they hadn't invited me when I was a backbencher, one of the few researchers in the Parliament, "We didn't know you were going to be Health Minister." And my retort was, "Nor did I." But had I been appointed to another cabinet ministry, it would have been useful for the Health Minister to have an informed colleague sitting around the cabinet table. I vividly remember one of my colleagues asking me why the Commonwealth should put $50 million towards a microscope in a room. He had no idea of the size and importance of the synchrotron, and I credit myself with educating some of my colleagues about the fact that the synchrotron was on the old drive-in theatre premises out just beside Monash, and it was the size bigger than a football field. It did help to get the $50 million. My message to you is that one of the most important things you can do is engage with backbenchers. They have time, you can develop some very useful and, with your assistance, informed and enlightened contacts. You may be undertaking research which has local implications. For example, my local council has just conducted a 4-year project on women at risk of homelessness. Your research may relate to a specific area, for example, rural or inner city. You need to identify local members, state and federal, who are responsible for areas or whose interests are covered by your research. Make an appointment to see them and explain how implementation of your research would assist their constituents. And don't forget your senators. You can identify those members of Parliament who have particular interest in social policy and social science research. You can See who to speak to on you can see who speaks on social policy bills, who are on various backbench social policy committees, those who serve on parliamentary social policy standing and select committees. You never know, a backbencher you met 12 months ago may be a minister today. Someone with whom you have made a connection and met when you weren't asking for anything. It's a relief when somebody comes to you and they just want to inform you about something, not asking you for money. You can't ask backbenchers for money, you can just inform them. And you find a friend in court. I have to say to you, when I was taking the embryo stem cell research bill through the chamber, it was a private member's bill, I had enormous support from Monash biomedical scientists, to the point where they said, if you don't understand some biological thing, I don't care if you ring me in the middle of the night, just ring up, because I only had me and 3 staff members and a draftsperson to draft this bill, and it was enormously helpful. But I knew I trusted them because they'd been to see me, because of my connection with Monash. But when a minister's flying around thinking, who can I talk to about this, to have met you and know that you're a decent scientist who are doing some really good research, it gives them confidence. You don't have to have a young assistant who thinks that picking someone out of the media is a good idea. Although I'm still saying that you should still be getting into the media. But the person, you met them, you weren't asking for anything, but they know you and they're more likely to seek your advice. The backbencher you met may not be the minister responsible for a social policy portfolio, but may end up the Treasurer, the Finance Minister, or another Cabinet Minister sitting around the ERC committee, which is incredibly important, where everyone tries to get, the Economic Review Committee, where everyone tries to get money from everybody else's portfolio. It's nice to have a few friends sitting there because some ministers are appointed to that committee and they want money, and you've got to put up a very good argument as to why you should get money. But to have a few people sitting around the ERC or the Cabinet table who are more aware of the issues than would otherwise been the case if you hadn't been and informed them. Let me tell you another example I just saw recently. In telling you the story, because I haven't been able to get back to her, I may misrepresent it slightly, but this is a researcher who's been doing some research in a country town in New South Wales on restorative justice. And she involved the local mayor in this project right from the very beginning, and then she involved the community, and what they did was they carried out a survey to see what crimes the community would tolerate having community service orders and what crimes really deserve someone to go to prison. And they found very, very strong, clear relationship between those petty crimes or, defacing property and petty theft and serious crimes. What she did next was to involve the state Member of Parliament and the federal Member of Parliament in looking at those results and how to affect their town and their community. And now she's got a little army who can go and look for money to actually implement this program and then evaluate it. How clever to involve the Members of Parliament at the beginning. She's got the local mayor, the state and the federal member all involved in her project. Now, not all research lends itself to that, but there's an innovative way of getting your message across of social science research that I think could make a huge difference to her country town. Now, you could also go all the way and stand for Parliament. And although it could be a very good idea, because we need to dilute that army of lawyers with a good sprinkling of social scientists. And there are a lot of lawyers. Adam Graycar's speech I referred to earlier, which was produced on a typewriter, was written in 1988, when I was serving my first year in the Senate chamber. We had an IBM Selectric typewriter, some of you remember those, with a limited memory and word processing capacity, and the printer was so large and noisy it had a huge perspex cover to reduce the noise. Officers were allocated on the order of who got elected last, and I was the last in 1987. I got the smallest office. The printer was so large it didn't fit in my office, and it was located under the stairs adjacent to my office. How much easier it is now. We have the ability to write draft after draft and edit and produce reports, reviews, papers in vast quantities. Some of you will remember typing a PhD thesis on a typewriter with 3 carbon copies. Maybe in the pre-word processing world, when public servants, politicians and researchers were more circumspect and economical influenced by the fact that the fruits of their labours were produced on a typewriter with a couple of carbon copies and then typeset and printed. We were not inundated with the mountain of reports we have now. From experience, I can attest that politicians drown in almost a daily flood of reports. They actually come tied in bundles and other documents, and this may be one of the reasons why implementation of policy is slow or doesn't happen at all. Now, I have an absolute aversion to good, solid, sensible reviews ending up in the graveyard of good intentions. My role as Age Discrimination Commissioner is a culmination of my education, teaching, political and ministerial experiences. Having straddled the fields of social science and politics, what I hope to achieve now is to expand on the work of my predecessor, Susan Ryan, in progressing implementation of her Willing to Work report on employment discrimination against older Australians and Australians with a disability. It was launched in May of this year and should be tabled in this parliamentary session this fortnight. The implementation of the recommendations are a top priority for the Disability Commissioner and myself. I also intend to contribute to and influence the adoption of the recommendations of the Elder Abuse Report, commissioned by the Attorney-General and being undertaken by the Australian Law Reform Commission. The Elder Abuse Inquiry is still underway, and by mid-December there'll be a draft discussion paper, and I urge those of you who are interested to contact the ALRC to get a copy of the report and make a submission if your area affects older people, particularly older people who may be in a situation where they could be abused. In a recent Radio National program on financial elder abuse, Brian Hurd, a Brisbane lawyer specialising in elder abuse, I'm going to meet him, expressed his reservations about the current inquiry. He said, "I'm sceptical, I'm cynical and I'm depressed because so many previous iterations on this issue have simply sat on bureaucrats' shelves." Poor old bureaucrats get blamed again. Let me disabuse Brian Hurd or any minister or bureaucrat who thinks the elder abuse report will simply sit on a shelf. I'm determined that's not going to happen. As well as these objectives, my role will, for example, also include promoting positive attitudes towards older Australians, calling out age discrimination when it rears its ugly head, and pursuing issues of homelessness, especially as they affect the fastest emerging group of homeless people, older Australian women. I hope this has been a call to action for all of us, that just as there have been missed opportunities to respond to the findings of the research from the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, we do not commit the same error. If we fail to drive the implementation of social science research, the invited speaker at the 2076 Cunningham lecture will have every right to condemn our hypocrisy and inertia. Thank you.